Blood pooled over the white lilies, soaking the pristine petals crimson. 10 heavily armed men closed in on Colorado's most ruthless kingpin, leaving him absolutely nowhere to run. He was a dead man, until a quiet, deaf florist looked him in the eye and did the truly unthinkable to save his life. The world for Alice Hastings was a symphony of vibrations. She hadn't heard the wail of a police siren, the crash of thunder, or the sound of her own voice since a childhood fever stole her hearing at the age of 7. Instead, she felt the city of Colorado in her bones. The subtle, rhythmic trembling of the floorboards told her when the L train was passing. The rattling of the reinforced glass windows warned her of the brutal November squalls sweeping in from Lake Michigan. But on the night of November 14th, the vibrations ripping through her flower shop, the Gilded Peony, were chaotic, frantic, violent. Alice was 28, a solitary woman who preferred the honest, predictable company of soil and stems to the complicated nuances of human interaction. She was in the back room, meticulously trimming thorns from a fresh batch of imported black Baccara roses, when a sudden massive impact shuddered through the entire building. It was forceful enough to knock several terracotta pots off the mahogany display shelves. She dropped her shears, rushing into the dimly lit storefront. A man was collapsed against the display counter. He was massive, draped in a charcoal bespoke Italian wool topcoat that was rapidly turning a slick, shiny black near his abdomen. He was gasping, one hand desperately clutching his side, the other gripping the edge of the marble counter with white-knuckled intensity. This was Dante Castiglione. Alice didn't know his name, nor did she know that he was the undisputed head of the Castiglione crime family, the ruthless architect of the city's underground port operations. She didn't know that his armored convoy had just been ambushed 3 blocks away by a heavily armed hit squad orchestrated by the rival O'Sullivan syndicate. All she knew was that a dying man had just crashed through her door, bringing the metallic scent of copper and gunpowder into a room that usually smelled of petrichor and eucalyptus. Dante looked up, his eyes a chilling, glacial grey locked onto hers. He raised a trembling finger to his lips in a universal plea for silence, then pointed toward the street. Alice moved toward him, her brow furrowed. She tapped her ear and shook her head, an apologetic but urgent gesture. "I am deaf." Realization flashed across Dante's pain-tightened features. He couldn't rely on her to hear them coming. But Alice didn't need to hear them. Through the soles of her worn boots, she felt the heavy, synchronized thud of footsteps hitting the pavement outside. It wasn't 1 or 2 men. It was a swarm. 10 pairs of heavy boots moving with military precision, surrounding the perimeter of her shop. Dante tried to push himself off the counter, his jaw clenched, intending to draw the fire away from the innocent civilian. He barely made it 2 steps before his knee buckled, sending him crashing into a display of white Casablanca lilies. Alice felt the floor tremble as the men outside began kicking at the heavy steel frame of her front door. The lock was industrial, but it wouldn't hold for more than 60 seconds against a concentrated assault. She had to make a choice: flee out the back and leave this stranger to be slaughtered among her flowers, or hide him. But hiding him wasn't enough. There was a literal trail of blood leading from the street over her threshold and directly to where Dante lay bleeding. Any half-witted street thug would follow the drops. She needed a diversion. She needed a lie written in blood. With the heavy thuds vibrating intensely through the floorboards, 30 seconds left, Alice did the unthinkable. She grabbed the heavy carbon steel floristry knife from her work belt. She didn't hesitate. Alice looked Dante dead in the eye, gripped the blade, and sliced it cleanly and deeply across the meaty part of her own left forearm. Dante's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. He reached out to stop her, but his strength failed him. Alice hissed her eyes, tearing up from the blinding pain, but she moved with manic efficiency. She let her own blood mix with the drops Dante had left on the floor. She dragged her bleeding arm against the edge of the counter, creating a chaotic smear, and then deliberately stumbled toward the back exit. She kicked open the heavy metal back door that led to the dark, rain-swept alley, smearing her bloody handprint on the doorknob and frame, letting her blood drip heavily onto the wet pavement outside. The false trail was set. Now she needed him out of sight. She rushed back to Dante. Grabbing him by the lapels of his ruined coat, she hauled him upward. Adrenaline gave her a terrifying, desperate strength. She dragged him behind the main counter to an antique, intricately carved oak potting table. Beneath it was a heavy rug, and beneath the rug was a relic from the 1920s, a Prohibition-era floor safe and smuggling compartment, barely large enough for a grown man, entirely encased in concrete. She hauled the trap door open. Dante, understanding her insane gamble, slid down into the cramped, icy darkness, curling his large frame to fit. Alice slammed the heavy wooden lid shut, threw the rug over it, and dragged a massive 200-pound cast-iron urn filled with soil and weeping figs directly over the seam of the trapdoor. Just as she dragged her bleeding body out from behind the counter, the front door gave way. The explosive vibration of the door violently hitting the interior wall sent shock waves through Alice's chest. The glass shattered, raining down like diamonds over the hardwood floor. She threw herself onto the ground amidst the broken glass and crushed lilies, clutching her bleeding arm, tears of genuine pain and cultivated terror streaming down her face. 10 men poured into the gilded peony. Alice couldn't hear the deafening bark of their tactical rifles sweeping the room, nor the harsh, aggressive shouts of their leader, Declan Hayes. Declan was a cold-blooded enforcer for the O'Sullivans, a man who left nothing to chance. From her position on the floor, Alice looked up at the intruders. Her breath hitched. She let out a silent, ragged sob, pointing a trembling, blood-soaked finger toward the open back door where the rain was blowing in. Declan stalked toward her. Alice felt the heavy thud of his boots, stopping mere inches from her face. He grabbed her roughly by the jaw, forcing her to look at him. His mouth moved aggressively, shouting questions she couldn't hear. She tapped her ear with her uninjured, shaking hand. She let the tears flow freely, projecting nothing but the absolute terror of an innocent, disabled woman caught in the crossfire of a monster. She pointed to her bleeding arm, then frantically pointed again to the back alley. He came through here. He hurt me. He ran that way. Declan's cold blue eyes scanned the room. He saw the trail of blood from the front door, mingling with Alice's blood, leading directly out the back exit, over the smeared doorknob, and vanishing into the rainy darkness of the alley. The ruse was flawless. The bleeding woman on the floor was just collateral damage, a victim pushed aside by a fleeing Dante Castiglione. Declan shoved her back down to the floor in disgust and signaled his men. Alice felt the mass exodus of vibrations as the 10 assassins poured out the back door, rushing blindly into the Colorado night to chase a ghost. Alice remained motionless on the floor for 3 agonizing minutes, counting the seconds waiting for the ambient vibrations of the shop to settle into a cold, empty stillness. When she was absolutely certain they were gone, she pushed herself up. Her arm throbbed with a sickening, hot pain. She ignored it. She dragged herself to the front, secured the heavy iron security grate over the shattered storefront, and locked the secondary bolts. Only then did she return to the heavy oak table. Putting her back against the cast-iron urn, she pushed with every ounce of strength she had left. It scraped across the floorboards. She threw back the rug and hauled open the trap door. Dante was unconscious. The confined air of the bunker was thick with the smell of blood. Panic flared in Alice's chest. She climbed down into the shallow bunker, slipping her arms under his shoulders, and dragged him up into the shop. His skin was alarmingly pale, clammy to the touch. The bullet wound in his side was a deep, jagged trench. It hadn't hit any major organs, but an artery was nicked. He was bleeding out fast. She couldn't call an ambulance. A man like this, hunted by men like that, would be killed the moment he arrived at a hospital. Alice sprinted to her supply closet. She didn't have medical supplies, but she had the tools of her trade. She returned with a bottle of high-proof rubbing alcohol, used for cleaning shears, heavy-duty green floral wire, a curved upholstery needle she used for weaving intricate funeral wreaths, and a clean roll of gauze. She tore Dante's shirt open, exposing the ruined flesh. She poured the alcohol directly over the wound. Dante's eyes snapped open. His body arched violently off the floor, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream. His hand shot out, wrapping around Alice's throat in a blind, reflexive instinct to kill whatever was hurting him. Alice didn't flinch. She couldn't hear his scream, but she felt the roar of it vibrating in his chest. She looked down at him, her hazel eyes steady, calming, completely devoid of fear. With her uninjured hand, she gently but firmly tapped the back of his hand, gripping her throat. Dante blinked, the feral haze clearing from his eyes. He realized where he was. He looked at the girl, the florist, who had sliced her own arm to save a Mafia don, and slowly released his grip, his hand dropping to the floor. Alice gave him a curt nod. She grabbed a wooden dowel used for staking orchids and pressed it against his lips. Bite down. He took it between his teeth. With ruthless, steady precision, Alice threaded the curved needle with the thick floral wire. It was barbaric. It was agonizing. But as she stitched the torn edges of his flesh together, sealing the leak that was draining his life, Dante Castiglione didn't look away from her. He watched the way her hands moved, bloody bruised yet incredibly delicate. He noticed the stark contrast between the violent reality of his world and the quiet, fierce grace of hers. He looked at her heavily bandaged forearm, the self-inflicted wound she had endured purely to give him a fighting chance. When she finally finished tying off the wire and packing the wound tightly with gauze and pressure tape, she slumped back against the display counter, utterly exhausted. Dante spat the splintered wooden dowel from his mouth. He reached slowly into his coat pocket, pulling out a sleek, blood-smeared silver lighter and a crushed pack of cigarettes. He offered her one. Alice shook her head. She picked up a small chalkboard, used for pricing flowers, and a piece of white chalk. She wrote in sharp, elegant script, "They are gone. You need a hospital. Or a mortician." She handed him the board. Dante wiped a smudge of blood from his mouth, took the chalk and wrote back. His handwriting was aggressive, dominating the slate. "No hospitals. My men are coming. Why did you do it?" Alice read the words. She looked at this terrifying man, a literal kingpin, sitting battered on the floor of her ruined sanctuary. She took the chalk back. "You were bleeding on my lilies, and 10 against 1 is cowardice." A low, vibrating chuckle rumbled in Dante's chest, a sensation Alice felt through the floorboards. The smile didn't quite reach his icy eyes, but the respect in them was profound. He had spent his entire life surrounded by hardened killers, scheming politicians and sycophants. Yet the bravest person he had ever met was a deaf florist armed with a pair of shears. 45 minutes later, the floorboards hummed with a new, distinct vibration. Heavy, luxurious SUVs pulling up to the curb. Dante's second-in-command, Leo Rossi, had finally tracked his boss's encrypted burner phone. 4 men in suits armed to the teeth breached the back door, their weapons raised. They froze when they saw their untouchable boss sitting on the floor, heavily bandaged with floral wire, sharing the silence with a petite woman in an apron. Dante waved them down. He gripped the edge of the counter, pulling himself to his feet with a painful wince. Leo rushed forward to support his weight. Dante stopped at the threshold. He turned back to Alice. The air between them was thick, charged with an unspoken gravity. He reached out and picked up a single unbroken white lily from the floor. He deliberately pressed his bloody thumb against one of the pristine white petals, staining it crimson. He placed the flower gently on her chalkboard, right next to a final message he had scrawled while she wasn't looking. Alice watched as Leo practically carried Dante out the door, dissolving into the black SUVs and the rainy Colorado night. Once the taillights faded, Alice walked over to the counter. She picked up the blood-stained lily, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked down at the chalkboard. In bold, jagged letters Dante had written, "A life for a life. I owe you mine. I will return." For 3 weeks, the gilded peony stood as a paradoxical monument to violence and rebirth. Within 48 hours of Dante Castiglione's bleeding departure, a crew of silent, terrifyingly efficient men in workwear had arrived at Alice's shop. They didn't speak a word to her. They simply replaced the shattered storefront glass with military-grade ballistic panes, installed a reinforced steel door, framed in solid oak, and left a thick manila envelope on her counter. Inside was $50,000 in crisp, untraceable bills and a handwritten note on heavy cardstock for the lilies. Alice's left arm throbbed daily, the jagged scar a raised pink reminder of the night she crossed the Rubicon. She poured the money into the shop, expanding her exotic orchid inventory and upgrading the climate control, but she never discarded the small chalkboard. Tucked behind the register, it still held the faint, chalky ghost of Dante's promise, "I will return." She also kept the white lily. It hung upside down in the back room, the petals dried and brittle, the singular rust-colored thumbprint of the Mafia Don forever immortalized on its surface. But in the underworld of Colorado, blood debts were never forgotten, and deception was a ticking time bomb. Across the city, in a smoke-filled warehouse by the rail yards, Declan Hayes was staring at a corkboard covered in crime scene photos. The O'Sullivan family was bleeding territory. Dante Castiglione hadn't died that night. He had vanished, recovered, and then unleashed a brutal systemic dismantling of the O'Sullivan network. Declan, a man whose reputation was built on predatory intuition, couldn't let the night of November 14th go. He kept replaying the raid on the flower shop in his mind. Something was wrong. The pieces didn't fit. He began to compile the inconsistencies. The blood volume. The trail leading into the alley was thick and steady, but Dante had been shot in the side. A man bleeding out at that rate would have collapsed within 100 yards. No body was ever found. The florist's wound. Declan reviewed the police report he had bribed a detective to acquire. Alice Hastings had claimed she was caught in the crossfire, but the laceration on her arm was a horizontal clean slice. Not a bullet graze, not shattered glass. It was a blade wound. The escape route. The heavy metal back door had been kicked open from the inside, but the blood smeared on the outer handle belonged exclusively to the florist, according to a rogue lab tech Declan paid off. The realization hit Declan like a physical blow. The deaf girl hadn't been a victim. She had been an accomplice. She had hidden the ghost of Colorado right under their noses and sent 10 armed men chasing shadows in the rain. Declan didn't just want answers. He wanted retribution. To strike at Dante now was impossible. The Don was heavily guarded in his fortified estate. But the girl was a soft target. A loose thread that, if pulled hard enough, would force Dante Castiglione out into the open. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the vibrations in the gilded peony shifted. Alice was arranging a sprawling centerpiece of blue hydrangeas and eucalyptus. The shop was empty, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor. Through the soles of her shoes, she felt the rhythmic rumble of a large vehicle idling illegally on the curb outside. Then came the footsteps. not the casual meandering steps of a customer browsing bouquets. These were heavy, synced, and deliberate. 4 men. She turned just as the front door opened. The chime above the door swung wildly, a sound she couldn't hear, but she saw the violent sway of the brass bell. Declan Hayes stepped into the shop, flanked by 3 men in heavy leather jackets. He looked different than he had in the chaos of the night raid. In the daylight, his eyes were a pale, deadened blue void of any humanity. He casually reached back, flipped the open sign to "Closed Morse," and locked the deadbolt. Alice's heart slammed against her ribs. The ambient vibrations in the room grew heavy, suffocating. She slowly set down her floristry shears, keeping them within an inch of her right hand. Declan stalked toward the counter, his boots thudding ominously. He didn't yell this time. He knew she was deaf. He reached into his coat, pulled out a suppressed semi-automatic pistol, and placed it gently on the marble counter, right next to the blue hydrangeas. He picked up her pricing chalkboard, wiped away the daily specials with his sleeve, and picked up the chalk. His handwriting was rigid and sharp. "He is alive because of you. Call him." Alice stared at the board. Her breath hitched, but she forced her face into a mask of total incomprehension. She took the chalk from him, her hand trembling just enough to sell the terror. "I don't understand. Who please leave, or I will press the panic alarm." Declan let out a humorless, breathless laugh. He reached out with lightning speed, grabbing her injured left arm and digging his thumb brutally into the healing scar. Alice dropped the chalk, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The pain flared hot and blinding, dropping her to her knees behind the counter. Declan leaned over the marble top, looking down at her. He wrote one more word on the board and dropped it onto her lap. "Bait." Declan's men began to tear the shop apart. Alice felt the violent shudders through the floorboards as they overturned heavy terracotta displays, smashed ceramic vases, and shredded thousands of dollars of imported blooms. It was psychological torture, designed to break her spirit before they used her phone to dial Dante's burner. Alice remained curled behind the counter, clutching her aching arm. She had to think. She had to survive. Declan dragged her up by her apron, shoving her against the back wall. He pressed the cold muzzle of the suppressed pistol under her chin, tapping his own pocket, mimicking the motion of a phone. "Make the call." What Declan didn't know, what no one outside of Dante's inner circle knew, was that the $50,000 wasn't the only thing Dante had left behind. The ballistic glass and the steel door were obvious deterrents, but the hidden high-definition security cameras integrated into the corner moldings, transmitting a live 24/7 feed directly to Leo Rossi's phone, were Dante's true insurance policy. He had promised her protection. Dante Castiglione did not break his vows. Alice squeezed her eyes shut as the gun pressed harder into her jaw. Through the floor, she felt a sudden, massive vibration. It wasn't the L train. It wasn't a truck. It was the reinforced steel back door of her shop being violently breached by a tactical battering ram. Declan spun around his weapon, leaving Alice's chin. Before he could even acquire a target in the dimly lit back room, the air in the shop practically exploded. Alice threw herself to the ground, covering her head, as the floor violently vibrated with the heavy rhythmic thuds of suppressed gunfire. She couldn't hear the chaos, the shouts, the shattering of glass, the brutal impact of bodies hitting the floor, but she felt the absolute devastation of the gunfight in her bones. 3 of Declan's men dropped in seconds, overwhelmed by a heavily armed strike team pouring in from the alley. Declan, realizing he had walked directly into a trap, panicked. He turned his weapon back toward Alice, aiming to execute his hostage and use the chaos to flee. He never pulled the trigger. A massive figure stepped out from the shadows of the exotic fern display. Dante Castiglione, moved with the lethal fluid grace of an apex predator. He didn't bother with a gun. As Declan raised his pistol, Dante closed the distance, driving the blade of a heavy carbon steel hunting knife perfectly between the ribs on Declan's right side. Declan's eyes went wide with shock. He gasped silently, his pistol clattering to the floorboards. Dante twisted the blade, his glacial grey eyes locked onto the enforcer's face, watching the life drain from the man who had dared to touch his saviour. He let Declan's lifeless body crumple onto a bed of crushed red roses. The shop fell completely, terrifyingly still. The vibrations ceased. Alice slowly lowered her arms, peering over the edge of the counter. The shop was a war zone. Petals, water, and blood painted the floor in a grotesque, impressionistic mural. Leo Rossi and 4 other Castiglione men were swiftly securing the perimeter, dragging the bodies toward the back exit, to be vanished into the ether of the Colorado underground. Dante stood in the center of the ruin. He was breathing heavily, his bespoke suit immaculate, save for the blood on his cuff. He looked around the destroyed shop, and then his eyes found Alice. He holstered his knife, grabbed a clean cloth from a nearby table to wipe his hands, and walked slowly toward her. He offered his hand. Alice looked at it for a long moment. She placed her small, dirt-smudged hand in his large, calloused one. He pulled her gently to her feet, his eyes immediately dropping to her left arm, noting the redness where Declan had grabbed her healing scar. A flash of pure, murderous rage crossed his face, quickly masked by stoic control. He didn't speak. He knew it was useless. Instead, he picked up the chalkboard that had fallen to the floor. It was cracked down the middle, but still usable. He wiped away Declan's threatening words and wrote carefully, "I told you I would return. Are you hurt?" Alice read the words, her breathing finally beginning to slow. She looked around at her destroyed livelihood. The Gilded Peony was in ruins for the second time in a month because of this man. Yet looking into Dante's eyes, she felt an inexplicable sense of safety. She shook her head and took the chalk. "My flowers seem to die whenever you visit." Dante let out a sharp, silent laugh, a vibration Alice felt perfectly as he stood just inches from her. He looked down at her, the ruthless mob boss completely disarmed by the profound resilience of a florist. He took the chalk back, his expression turning deeply serious. "The O'Sullivans will keep coming. This life is deadly. You can no longer stay here. I am buying you a new shop, anywhere in the world, or—" He paused, the chalk hovering over the slate. He looked at her, his glacial eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like vulnerability. "Or you stay in Colorado. With me. Under my absolute protection. Forever." Alice read the board. The gravity of the choice weighed heavily in the silent room. She could run. She could take his money, move to the countryside, and live out her days in peaceful, uninterrupted quiet. It was the logical choice, but as she looked at Dante Castiglione, a man of profound violence who had just risked his entire empire to save her, she realized the quiet life no longer appealed to her. She had tasted the chaotic, vibrant, terrifying frequency of his world, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly awake. Alice didn't write anything back. Instead, she walked past him, stepping carefully over the debris, and went into the back room. Dante watched her go, a heavy, sinking feeling in his chest. He thought she was packing to leave. He had terrified her. He had brought death to her door, and now she was walking away. A moment later, Alice returned. She held something delicate in her hand. She walked up to Dante and pressed the object into his palm. It was the dried white lily preserved perfectly, bearing the rust-colored stain of his blood on its petal. She looked up into his eyes, reached out, and gently tapped the lapel of his suit over his heart. Then she signed something. She knew he didn't know American Sign Language, but the gesture was universally understood. She pointed to him, brought her hands together to signify a bond, and pointed to the ground they stood on. "I stay with you." Dante looked down at the blood-stained lily in his hand, a symbol of the night. An untouchable kingpin was brought to his knees, only to be saved by the silent, unyielding strength of a florist. He closed his hand gently around the flower, pulling Alice into his chest. In the heart of Colorado's darkest empire, surrounded by the wreckage of violence, Alice finally found a rhythm she wanted to feel for the rest of her life. Thank you so much for experiencing this incredible story of Dante and Alice. If the silent strength of the florist and the ruthless devotion of the Mafia boss kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this gripping tale with your friends who love suspense, romance, and unexpected twists. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, original audio dramas every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Alice's shoes?